Thank you. Can I go now?
Lorraine Kelly was so vociferous, and yet the Lord gave you utterance for that interview. And it's so encouraging to see so many Christian believers behind you and praying for you and encouraging you. Hazelmary, I want to ask you a few questions. I wonder if you could tell me, from a legal perspective, the cases, yourself and the MacArthurs, are quite different. But in terms of the personal experience, you've been in a similar position to the MacArthur family. You've stood in their shoes, so to speak. I wonder what you would say to them ahead of the court hearing on Thursday.
Well, first of all, I want to say how glad Pete and I are to be back here, because when we left a few weeks ago, we very much felt that we were going to kind of miss out on the hearing towards the end of this week. And we just privately said to the Lord Jesus, we've no money, we're getting on, making the arrangements for the journey, and it's not easy coming from Cornwall to Belfast. If there is any way, Lord, that we could possibly get back there for the case, then that would be just great. And then a couple of days later, the Institute spoke to us and said, how do you feel about going back for the hearing? Now, Pete and I knew that only the Lord Jesus knew that, so we said yes, because we wanted to come back and stand with you when you're supporting the MacArthur family. As far as what they must be feeling now, and I just wish that I could take the nerves away from them, because going into a court is not something that most of us would seek to do, and it is nerve-wracking, especially when, in our case, absolutely everything that Pete and I had lived and worked for the last 30-odd years was on the line. And we were very nervous about giving evidence, because we were nervous about letting our friends down, about letting our supporters down, letting the Institute down, and letting the Lord Jesus down. And at the end, when we were just about to go into the court, you get the feeling that you're absolutely stripped of everything that's to do with you, and that you really have to throw yourself on the mercy of the Lord Jesus Christ. And he never disappointed.
Well, of course, we're hoping and we're praying that the Ashers case is all finished at County Court stage. We know we're not likely to get a judgment for a little bit of time, but eventually we trust that the judge will rule in the MacArthur's favour. We trust that the Commission won't start appealing, and that will be it. But for you, it was much more of a drawn-out process, wasn't it? Can you take us through the process, starting with the County Court?
Yes, we were called to trial in Bristol. By that time, we'd already had our situation reported to the local police station, and Pete and I are now on record as having a record with the police of a non-violent hate crime. So, and now we went to face the trial. We went through that. As Callum has said, we had to wait several weeks for the judgment. After that, we all thought, the Institute and ourselves thought, that there, as I said, there are still arguments to be made. So it then went to the High Court, where the judgment was upheld. And later on, we all agreed that it was perhaps worth going to the Supreme Court with the same arguments. And that's what happened. But the whole process took what was it? It was the men came to us in 2008, Mr. Hall and Mr. Preddy, and our final hearing was in the Supreme Court towards the end of 2013. So the whole thing had dragged on for 5 years, in fact. But as far as getting it out there and waking the church up as to what was going on in our society, hard though it was, I'm glad it happened, because it seems to have had that effect on churches and on individuals, that people are beginning to realise that these folk have had it their own way for far too long, and we need to stand up and be counted now.
Well, you had a fine of £3,600 to pay. Now, £3,600 is an awful lot of money to find. How were you able to pay that?
Well, the original trial took place in December 2010. We then went through Christmas and New Year not knowing what was going to happen to us. And the judgment was finally read down, I think at the end of January, maybe the beginning of February. Through that time, we'd received cards and letters from folk that we didn't know, and checks had dropped out and money had dropped out and so on. And having worked all our lives and been more used to giving to Christian work, this was a very strange situation for us to find ourselves in. And in fact, we had a real struggle to put pride aside and accept these gifts from folk and the encouragement that they were giving us. When we went to hear the judgment read down, the judge then said how much he was going to award, £1,800 to each of the two men. When we got outside, the legal team, who knew our dire straits, said to us, "How are you going to manage to find that money?" And I said, during Christmas and New Year, £3,650 had come in. And this is at a time when the hotel was closed, so we had no way of actually making that money for ourselves. But the Lord Jesus knew ahead that it was going to be £3,600, and the 50 quid extra was like, and there you are, my girl, you can have that for being so faithful. But this is our God. It was £50 over and not £50 under. It was a great thing. So.
Well, it reminds us that the Lord is no man's debtor.
No.
We do rejoice in that. Well, obviously, it was the long process. You appealed, you went to the Court of Appeal, you went to the Supreme Court. Can you tell us how you and Peter were feeling over the course of that process? I know that Peter wasn't well, for example.
Yes.
Can you share some of that with us, please?
Yes, excuse me a minute. The judgment, by the time the judgment was read down, Pete had been helicoptered out of Marazion and taken with a heart condition to our local hospital. He was there for several weeks, and then they moved him up to Plymouth, which is about an hour and a half's run from us. They eventually operated on him the day that the judgment was read down, which is why I'm there alone at the court. It was a very stressful time because all that kind of thing is going on out of the limelight. You don't know whether you're going to have a business at the end of it or whether you're going to be living under a bridge somewhere by the time they finished with you. So it was a time of real trusting because two lovely things happened. One is we learned to trust the Lord Jesus. I thought I was an okay Christian before, but I've learned such a lot through this experience. And if it took this awful experience to teach me what it's like to rest in the Lord Jesus, then bring it on. And then they had this long run to get up and down to Pete. Of course, he didn't come through the operation very well. So there was a time of him having to stay in hospital a lot longer than would be normally. During that time, we were receiving death threats, and there was a certain amount of damage done to the hotel. That damage lasted over the entire 5 years, because every time we were back up on the news or in the newspaper, they came back and did a fresh lot of damage. The problem with the telephone, because a lot of people said to me, why don't you just not answer the phone? Well, for a start, it's the hotel. We ought to be answering the phone. But secondly, my husband was in hospital a long way away. And I had the particular morning after the judgment was read down, the hospital rang me and said, how long will it take you to get here? And I said an hour and a half. And they said, well, can you be ready to leave at a moment's notice because he's not well? So I washed and changed and dressed and went back to bed. And the phone went at 7 o'clock. And I answered it, and it was verbal abuse. And when you try and defuse it by saying, I'm sorry you feel like that, my friend, bang, the phone goes down. I'll try and keep it short, but that happened again at 7:10. So I had to answer it because Pete was in hospital. It happened again at 7:20. And I said, this really must be taking up a lot of your morning. Can't we have a chat about this? Bang, down goes the phone. At 7:30, I thought, here we go again. But it was the hospital to tell me that he'd taken a turn for the worse and they were taking him back into theatre. So you see, whoever it was on the other end was really messing with me, more, I think, than they ever thought possible. But that's the kind of thing that's gone on all through the period, really.
A real terrible time with the vandalism as well. And well, support in Belfast, moving on, support in Belfast for Asher's Baking Company seems to be very strong. And I think I'm right in saying that the business hasn't been too affected, at least in terms of the sales. But for yourselves, it was quite a different situation, wasn't it?
Yes, because we, back home, to advertise in the best magazines and on the most worthwhile websites, you need to be inspected. And the people who do the inspection, and there's only one scheme, the people who do the inspection are the English Tourist Board, or Visit England as they call themselves now. They asked us to leave, and that meant then that we couldn't go on the websites that bring in the most business or in the magazines that do the same. So at a stroke, we lost between 60 and 70% of our business. And naturally, that's affecting us. The only thing we've got left now that we can use is our website.
Well, you know, you've mentioned the threats, you've mentioned the tourist board, you've mentioned the vandalism and the difficulty of ill health and stress at the time. But you have also experienced some incredible generosity. I wonder, can you share some of that with us as well this evening?
Well, people have been wonderful, and folk have kept us going in the day-to-day expenses. But at one point, in fact, it's at the same time that Daybreak interview was done, the house was on the market, and it was we had a couple of offers. But the offers weren't as good as we'd hoped, because it was well known publicly that we were in dire straits, and the view out there amongst buyers was, well, they'll take what they can get for it. So when we did our sums, we discovered that because we had the mortgage to pay off, and we'd have to pay capital gains tax, which hadn't occurred to us before, our accountant worked it all out, and we would be left with enough to put a mobile home on a piece of land for Pete and I. And we also have my brother and our colleague, Bernie, who is our hotel chef and is my cousin and has lived with us for well over 30 years. We're a family of four, in other words. So there was no way that we could sell. So we felt backed into a corner, And then suddenly we had an email from a lady in Essex who said, "You must not sell. If you sell, they have won." And she has been paying our mortgage month by month ever since. But it's all about sacrifice, because she's not a wealthy woman. She does own some properties, and they bring in the same amount of money every month as is our mortgage. And she, in other words, all the money she gets from these properties that she owns comes straight to us to keep us there.
Well, it's a reminder, a reminder of the Lord's no man's debtor.
Wonderful.
And you experienced an even greater blessing, even in the midst of the trial. Can you share that with us too, please?
Callum is referring to lots and lots of telephone calls around the time the judgment was given. And as I painted the picture, Pete was still in hospital. One telephone call one night, Bernie came into me, this is my cousin, came into me, and he said, "There's a lady on the phone who says she's your foster sister." Now, Shirley had run away from home 43 years before and not left any trail of where she was or how to get hold of her, nothing at all. And we were living in London at the time, Shirley and I, and my parents, and it was very difficult. The only thing we knew about her was where she worked. Well, they weren't going to give us any details, so it was impossible to try and find her. Here we are, 43 years later, and she's come on the phone because she'd seen it in the paper and she thought she'd get back in touch. So when times are grim, I have to comfort myself with that out of everything that's happened, I've got my sister back, and it's great. Absolutely great. Well, it turns out she only lives in Plymouth, which I was going to on a daily basis to visit Pete. So, of course, I was able to see her after visiting one night. And the next day, my dad had a diabetic attack, and he collapsed onto a glass fruit bowl, and he cut himself to ribbons and was admitted to hospital. So I rang Shirley and I said, "I can't be in two places at once, Shirley. I won't be coming up tonight to see Pete. I'm going to have to go and see Dad to find out how he is." And Shirley said, "Well, would you like me to go and see Pete?" I said, "Yes, please." But I thought, I better ring Pete, because he's going to open his eyes and see her standing at the bottom of the bed and wonder that he's in some kind of hallucination. So, but no, it's been lovely. It's been really lovely.
Well, Hazelmary, perhaps that's a good place to leave it. We thank the mercy of our God, even in hard providences. He does bless us even in these circumstances. We'd like to thank you for coming, and to Peter for coming with you for this trip to Northern Ireland. And we will call it a day at that. Thank you.